And a hearty welcome to one and all. Just received news that an actor whose career I have followed and who I adore, Carl Weathers, has passed away. Not too many details available, and details aren't important. What is important is a big part of the childhood, the movie-going history and fandom of a large segment of boomers and Gen Xers and even younger fans who maybe only knew him through Grief Karga and The Mandalorian. He's somebody who is worth more than an episode of a podcast, but he's somebody whose life and work is worth remembering and kind of holding near and dear, as so many of his movies and appearances on TV I have held dear over the years. So I'm dedicating this episode to Carl Weathers, a former football player who ended up a very successful actor, and certainly the role of Apollo Creed became not just synonymous with him, but when people think of Sylvester Stallone, generally speaking, they think of Rocky first, Rambo second. And of course, to even have two roles that iconic is unusual. When we think of Carl Weathers, the first thing that most of us think of is, oh, Apollo Creed. Then we say he played Dylan in Predator. I might actually say he played Sergeant Jericho Jackson in Action Jackson before Predator, but that's beside the point. It is a somber day, but it is a time to remember a legendary figure in not just action films, but in the history of cinema, and then somebody who joined the incredible Star Wars franchise and actually got a Primetime Emmy nomination, if I'm not mistaken, for his role. And he directed some episodes of the series, The Mandalorian. Now, I am a Star Wars fan, right? But I'm not like two things. Number one, I'm not a negative fan. I'm not one of those people who complains about every little thing on all 9 movies while claiming that Star Wars is my life, but I hate everything about it. No, I'm a very positive Star Wars fan. But there is a lot of IP related to Star Wars that I'm not familiar with. I've only seen a couple of episodes of Mandalorian. I haven't seen Andor. There's a lot of programs I just didn't get into. And I had trouble connecting with The Mandalorian. And I kind of started watching it because I became a fan of Pedro Pascal with The Last of Us. The Mandalorian just didn't click for me. And Book of Boba Fett, I never even started. I liked Ashoka. But needless to say, he made an impression in just the brief, I saw, I guess, about 5 episodes. His time as Grief Karga, you could see that he was there and he was bringing it. But a lot of Hollywood, in a good sense, are when actors are cast in roles that maybe it's a surprise that they were cast in the first place. Maybe it wasn't the intention of very intelligent, talented, canny people in the business to cast them or somebody like them. And it's just the magic of movies. It works out. Now, with the original Rocky, there was a lot of chatter that maybe Joe Frazier himself, because Joe appears in a cameo, as many, if you've seen the movie, you remember it's kind of a funny cameo. But there was some talk of Joe Frazier, maybe it would be Ken Norton. And I feel like if Ali had been younger and if he had already retired or had just kind of been, his health was starting to slip, unfortunately, by, about 1976-ish, there was a sense that this is not looking good for him. He probably should stop fighting. But the point is that he was still fighting and continued to fight. So he wasn't going to stop his career to make a movie anyway, even if they wanted to do, which would have been kind of wacky casting. And he was making his own movie about his life, which was not that great. It was called The Greatest. So when they decided, the producers, that is, Erwin Winkler and Robert Chartoff, after Stallone got involved, and they decided, okay, we can't use Ali. That's not happening. We can't do Joe Frazier. We can't do Kenny Norton. So we're not going to use an actual fighter in this role. We're going to have to cast an actor who simply looks the part. And a story that I told in another space, not during a podcast episode, is that Sylvester Stallone was not an unknown. You sometimes will read things on the internet or see stories which seem to suggest that he was a complete unknown at the time of Rocky. It's not really true. It is true that he was financially strapped, but he was not an entire unknown. He had appeared in movies. He had been in a movie that Quentin Tarantino talked about in the Stallone documentary, being a huge fan of, and where Sly was first on his radar. That would be the very young Quentin Tarantino, The Lords of Flatbush. He's not the star, but he makes an impression. And he was in an adaptation of Raymond Chandler's Farewell, My Lovely, starring Robert Mitchum. So he had been around. He wasn't a complete unknown. He wasn't somebody who nobody had ever heard of. He had people who were already fans on a lesser scale, but that he was known to some segments in the movie business already. Like when he submitted the script, there were plenty of people when they saw the name that said, hey, that's the kid from Lords of Flatbush. It was Perry King's buddy or whatever. So when the producers were trying to find their perfect Apollo Creed, the casting call would have been something on the order, because I didn't read the call sheets. I don't know if they've ever published the call sheets, like on the internet or something like that. It's one of the funny things that's so great. Like, for example, they have published call sheets for Back to the Future, and you'll see that Christopher Lloyd was way down on the list of possible people to cast. I mean, it seems insane in that instance that they were talking about casting Mark Mothersbaugh, the great musician, Devo, groundbreaking group. But what the fuck was that? Could you imagine a movie with Mark Mothersbaugh instead of Christopher Lloyd? I sure as hell can't. Yeah, Mark Mothersbaugh, in the movie The Flash, they could have done this when they say that Eric Stoltz was in Back to the Future in that alternate run out. Yeah, Eric Stoltz was Marty McFly and Mark Mothersbaugh was Doc Brown. But the call sheets and the casting call itself probably said something like, here's the basic story, and we need an actor who can at least physically look the part. We're looking for, if they were an Ali type of fighter, but a more fearsome, he's joking around, he's making it, with the nicknames and the rhyming and all of that, but this is a stone cold killer in there. This isn't a guy who, in the case of Ali, was almost trying to almost gently render his opponents unconscious, as if that's a thing in boxing, but not somebody who was going out to take someone's head off. And the Apollo Creed that we're presented with in the first movie has never been taken the distance. Ali, he stopped most of the fighters, and when he was younger, he would call the round, but he was not that. He wasn't a one-man wrecking crew in the ring in the manner of what we get from Apollo Creed. That whatever his record was, like 45-0 with 45 knockouts, like crazy, crazy power on top of the speed and the ability to do verse and rhymes, the master of disaster, the king of sting, the count of Monte Fisto, all of that stuff. But when Carl Weathers read for Apollo Creed, he wasn't told who he was reading with. He didn't know Sylvester Stallone at the time. Again, he wasn't really that deep. He had been in a couple of movies, but he wasn't a big part of the movie business. And it's not like you could Google, who am I doing the scene with? It didn't matter. They didn't tell him his name, and he didn't recognize Sylvester Stallone. He probably hadn't seen Lords of Flatbush. Now, with every piece of information available, he no doubt would have known, oh, this is the guy that wrote the script. So they didn't say, you're going to be doing the scene where you're having a press conference for the fight, and you're going to be reading it with the guy that wrote the script. You may have seen him in Lords of Flatbush or Farewell, My Lovely, and maybe he would have said, I didn't see those movies, but he would have known who he was working with. He thought he was working with either a stand-in or just some random kid that was reading the lines and standing in for Rocky Balboa. So they did the scene, and Stallone didn't fire properly. he didn't really hit his marks as well as he could have. I mean, shit happens. He may have read the same thing 50 times with how many dozens of different actors. So Stallone was a little bit off, according to legend, of this particular audition. And Weathers hit his marks, but he was aggravated when the audition was over because he felt that the kid that he was working with had ruined his chance. And he said something like, I think I blew the audition. Who the fuck was this guy that you had me read with? He's terrible. And that got back to Stallone, who had really liked Carl Weathers' audition. Stallone didn't have the reaction that other people may have had. He said, well, fuck that guy. He said, that's Apollo Creed energy right there. That's the guy I want. That's our Apollo Creed. And history thanks that weird moment of Stallone not doing that well during Carl Weathers' audition, according to what the story that, that's something that you could find on the internet. But he was cast. And to say that he took that role and ran with it, he really ran with it. Because every moment that he's on screen as Apollo Creed, he's electric. He's the big personality, not Stallone's Rocky Balboa. Rocky Balboa is a quiet guy. He is a quiet, humble guy who is being given the chance of a lifetime and is not gonna squander it. Now, if we're being honest and, the reality land aspect of it, it's very unlikely that something like that would happen anywhere near that way. And yes, we are led to believe that Rocky Balboa was a prodigious talent who simply didn't work hard enough to have the career that he otherwise could have. He ends up working as a strong arm for a loan shark and the whole thing. But the movie does give us the idea that he isn't just some tomato can. This was a guy who had it in him to be a top tier, a top 10 heavyweight fighter, and he just was farting around too much, didn't work hard enough. But he had the tools. And then, even though it was kind of later in life for him and his career seemed to be kind of lurching to a halt, when he is fully engaged and committed, we see the fighter that he could have been in that first fight with Apollo Creed, who I guess is a little bit past his prime. So without getting bogged down in the kind of mechanics and theatrics, Carl Weathers got to play that role of Apollo in Rocky 2 and 3 and 4. And even though, spoiler alert, Apollo Creed dies in Rocky 4 pretty early in the movie. It's not really a spoiler. It elevated Carl Weathers' career to the next level because he is such a strong presence. There are some people who didn't necessarily start off as actors and nevertheless have very strong screen presence. And Carl was one of those people. And again, it's credit to Stallone that in the early scenes between them in Rocky 4, that's where they fight the Russian. It's twice the size of both of them. Dolph Lundgren, gotta love him. Love the guy, right? But Weathers is so strong in those early scenes where he is desperate to hold on to the man that he has been for so long, the best fighter in the world. I love you, Rock, but as he said, you fight great, but I'm a great fighter. And that's kind of a spin-off on something that was said by Floyd Patterson about Ali, the character that, as we say, Apollo Creed was clearly modeled after. Patterson was somebody who had his ups and downs in real life with Ali, ultimately was in his corner, despite the kind of negative bullshit that had gone on between them. They fought twice, but they had great respect. And what Floyd said, a lot of people didn't understand. What a lot of people didn't understand is that guys like me, we were great fighters, but that guy was history. And I believe that that's what Apollo Creed is saying when he was saying, you fight great, but I'm a great fighter. I don't know that he means it as a slight on his buddy, but he's saying, I'm an all-timer. Rocky ultimately ended up being an all-timer, but he got to the game late. He got to the top level late in life, way later. And that was something that came up in the Creed movies, that Adonis, the son of Apollo, doesn't really get into it until it's almost too late for him to really have the kind of career that his talent would suggest he should have, or the kind of global imprint. But one quote what Carl Weathers said in an interview many years ago, when things really took off for him after the death of Apollo Creed, he said, it feels like when Apollo died, my life as an actor truly began. And he had the opportunity to play roles which challenged him, which did something different other than play Apollo Creed, which he did so beautifully in those 4 films. And Apollo has more of an arc than Rocky, if you really want to get technical. Because, yes, he's flashy. He's got a shit ton of money. He lives a comfortable life. Yeah, it's not really a comfortable profession, getting beat up. But we were led to believe that he hadn't even really had that many competitive fights, that he was just walking through everybody. But his character goes from a certain point where he's always joking, he's cutting at Rocky, and then he grows to respect him a tremendous amount. And their friendship, I think, is really great. It's one of the most memorable things really about Stallone's career is the way that he, as writer, was able to figure out how to do it and not make it seem hokey or ridiculous. It works. You know, Code of the Gladiator, they share it. You know, and we never find out, we don't see that third fight between them that took place where it wasn't recorded, you know, and Rocky kind of indicates that he won the fight. And then Rocky confirms that to Adonis Creed. Who won that third fight? Well, he did. And we don't know exactly what it was, whether they just after an hour, Rocky was so beat up or he was more beat up or Rocky had to tap or he was, you know, knocked unconscious. But it's enough to know. And again, Stallone not showing the ego, because he was a guy who didn't like to lose in movies. He didn't like his characters dying. That he let that go because he felt very strongly that it was important to establish, yes, my guy, my character, Balboa, beat Creed at the end of Rocky II. But it doesn't mean that we're not supposed to believe that Apollo Creed was a better fighter than Rocky Balboa. Weathers in the movie Predator, opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger, is phenomenal. He's so dynamic in his portrayal of Al Dillon. He's so good. And right from the moment that we're introduced to him, where he's wearing a kind of a suit and tie, but he doesn't have the suit on because it's like 90 degrees in the middle of the jungle. And that iconic bicep shot with the two guys, with Arnold, who was still fucking jacked at that point. You know, he was long retired from the sport of bodybuilding already. He was 6+ years retired from bodybuilding when Predator was shot. And man, he looked ridiculous. He's fucking huge. But what his character does in that movie and what Weathers makes us believe, it is a classic horror movie trope in the so-called philosophy of horror, in that kind of movie, in a monster movie, set mostly in broad daylight, really until the end. He's the character who doesn't believe there's a monster. That character is usually played by a teenager, you know, in the dead teenager movies of the 70s and 80s, or Nightmare on Elm Street, even Halloween. Nobody wants to believe that there's something otherworldly going down. He's the guy that is the skeptic. There's a couple of guys running around there, we got to take them down. And even Arnold, who a few minutes earlier in the movie would not have believed that we're dealing with spacemen here, still don't understand, do you, Dylan? Even in that movie, his character has an arc. He is a kind of cutthroat bureaucrat. Don't we love that word, bureaucrat? He's like a DC guy. He's become a DC guy. What happened to you, Dylan? You used to be someone I could trust. I woke up. Why don't you? You're an asset, an expendable asset, and I used you to get the job done. Got it. From that point, his character doesn't do a 360, to use a line from another Arnold movie. If I did a 360, I would have gone all the way around and ended up right back where I started. He does a 180, and he actually grows and changes. Rather than let Arnold risk his life to get one of their men, he goes, knowing it's a suicide mission. But he screwed Arnold and his team over, and it's enough. And I got to try to do this on my own. You get your people the hell out of here. And it's a great moment, because we know, well, this movie is not going to end with Apollo Creed killing the Predator. It's going to end up being Arnold mano a mano. And that's, of course, exactly how it happens. But Weathers is so solid and so strong in that movie. And he looks fucking unbelievable. He's even more impressive physically than he was in any of the Rocky movies. And that led to our famous joke that as impressive as Carl was, as jacked as he was standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the guy looks like he never touched a weight in his life. And that became a running gag at Bev's gym for years. What do you think of this guy? It doesn't matter. Ronnie Coleman, this guy looked like he never touched a weight in his life. I would never have said that out loud to Ronnie Coleman. But Predator is a great movie. It is a great movie, and not just because the script is solid by the Thomas brothers, Jim and John Thomas, a strong script, great direction from John McTiernan, great direction. So many pieces of inventive camera work, tracking shots, things he was able to do with the lenses to play around a little bit. Fantastic musical score by Alan Silvestri. Everything in that movie works. The effects work. The practical effects done during production, fantastic. But I think of Carl as much as I think of Arnold. I think about his character starting off, some damn fool accused you of being the best. And where his character ends up. Fantastic. So good. Now, if I'm being honest, the Carl Weathers movie that I have seen by far the most, let the haters hate, let the shaming commence, Action Jackson. Starring a very young, on the rise Sharon Stone, or co-starring, a singer-actress named Denise Matthews, who went by Vanity professionally. She was in The Last Dragon, a great movie. Boy, do I love The Last Dragon. But she was in that with a Timac. That's the name of the performer. Fantastic. Julius J. Carey III, Show Nuff. That's the movie with Bruce Leroy. It is fucking great. That's like a Motown movie. Well, it was actually called Berry Gordy's Last Dragon. Craig T. Nelson in Action Jackson plays the villain. It was just before the show Coach went through the roof. I think that he may have gotten Coach as a result of how solid he was in Action Jackson. So it's like if you only know Craig T. Nelson from Coach, where he's so good in that show, right? Man, he's a fucking dastardly villain in Action Jackson. Peter Delaplane, he was an automobile magnate in that movie. But Carl Weathers as Action Jackson in a kind of rare lead. And there was some controversy at the time because Spike Lee had a movie that was ready to come out called School Days. And the studio got nervous because Action Jackson was scheduled to be released. And they, as dumb as this sounds, they were nervous about releasing two black-themed films on the same day. And Spike talked about this. It wasn't an autobiography. It was a book. It was called 5 for 5, I believe, where he talked about, up to and including Malcolm X, if I'm not mistaken. But he talked about how he said that this is ridiculous. If you think that this movie is good and you think that my movie is good, just let it go. But what the hell? So they fucked around with the release date. But I saw Action Jackson in theaters in Florida with my grandfather, Grandpa Nat Cohen. May he rest in peace. Titan, Grandpa Nat. What a man. Made it to 96, still living alone, still driving. Outlived 4 girlfriends. May they rest in peace. Unbelievable. He did not like Action Jackson. I left the theater at the end of that movie. I was so excited. I was so fired up. I wanted to see it again the next day, if we're being honest. What a badass movie that was. And I loved seeing Carl in a lead where he was not just a great reactive supporting character. He's driving the action, almost literally. He's the man. And it's a terrific performance. The movie is, if we're being honest, it's crap, okay? It's garbage. It is not a good movie. I would liken it to, and here's another one, go ahead and shame me. I love the movie Cobra with his buddy Stallone. The tribute to Dirty Harry that Sly pulled off. Cobra is super entertaining, but it is not a good movie. I could sit here picking apart all of the plot holes and all of the ridiculous bullshit that takes place in that film and how over the top it is. Another Stallone movie, which is not really that great, over the top, but I love that one too. But Action Jackson, for all of its faults, and Robert Davi, another actor, terrific in almost every movie in the 80s into the 90s. He's still active. He was in The Goonies. He's the guy who, Die Hard, he's Special Agent Johnson, no relation. Davi is such a distinctive actor. But Action Jackson is so entertaining. And I've seen that film at least 15 times, start to finish. And there is a joke in that film that I did not realize was a joke when I first saw it. Naive 14-year-old Jeremy didn't get the joke. So Vanity, she was such a beautiful lady, Denise Matthews, just so stunning. She plays a lounge singer who kind of works for he works for Craig T. Nelson's character, Peter Delaplane. He's having an affair with her. He's running around on a spectacular Sharon Stone with Vanity's character. And there's a scene in the movie where and it's interesting that this is even in the film when you think about it, because it's Carl Weathers' story, but I guess this scene played so well that they wanted to have it, in the film. So Vanity is singing a very kind of sexy, slinky nightclub number. I think the song is called Faraway Eyes. The name of the character is Sydney. I forgot that temporarily. See, my memory is not always on point, especially when I get ahead of steam. So she's singing a song in an empty, really nice club. And Craig T. Nelson is sitting there looking very calm. He's got a slight smile on his face. She sings, she slinks, and she's moving around, and she finishes the song. And I'll never forget this. They're in the theater, and he does not react. He doesn't clap. He doesn't say, wow, babe, you're so hot. Nothing. He has zero reaction to her singing this song in this, she's wearing heels, mini dress. She looks great, the whole thing. She's a little surprised by his lack of reaction, and she goes over to him and says, I expected a standing ovation. And Craig T. Nelson, without changing facial expression, goes, you're getting one. And I remember people in the audience laughing at that line. And virginal 14-year-old me didn't understand why it was funny. Not that long later, when I saw the film at home, by that time I got the joke. Okay, I see what he's saying. He's not he might actually be being literal. I expected a standing ovation. You're getting one. But that movie, while trash, super entertaining. And, I'm sorry they didn't make a sequel, but the movie didn't really do that well at the box office. And, that is unfortunate. But he appeared on a lot of different TV shows over the years before The Mandalorian, and a lot of Gen Xers and elder millennials love to talk about his role in Happy Gilmore as Chubb, opposite Adam Sandler. Forgive me, another let the flaming and shaming commence. I'm not really a fan of Happy Gilmore. It's just okay. Adam Sandler is somebody that I've always been a fan of, but there are a lot of his movies that I'm supposed to like that they just don't work for me. Didn't really like Billy Madison. Happy Gilmore is okay. My favorite Sandler film from the kind of first iteration of his, foray as a huge movie star, I like Punch Drunk Love, Paul Thomas Anderson film. Most people don't. But that movie I thought really worked. And Sandler's more recent stuff, fantastic. Uncut Gems, Hustle, even You're So Not Invited to My Bar Mitzvah, very, very good. So, but Weathers continued to work. And if you kind of Google him on the Internet Movie Database, he did a lot of really good work on TV. I remember there was a series that he was in just after Rocky, and I believe before he got Action Jackson. And it was something that I was really looking forward to because they had kind of teased it for quite some time. And the series was called Fortune Dane. Or maybe when I say series, I'm not explaining that right. I believe it was a pilot for what was supposed to be like a weekly series. And I don't know if it ever got picked up. It may have had an initial run of episodes. This I don't know. But when I watched that, it was on video, and I found it on VHS a couple of years later. And I was like, man, this is terrific. This would have been a really good series. I think his character on that show was a police officer who had some kind of, I don't know if it was a scandal, but he ended up just kind of being a lone wolf, like what was that show, the Avery Brooks character from Spencer for Hire, where somebody has maybe a military or police background, The Equalizer, like that kind of thing. But it didn't get picked up, it didn't go forward, whatever it was. One thing that people always said about Carl Weathers is that he was never not in shape. He was somebody who exercised, like every day. He was always fit. And there were even moments, if you look at some of the pictures of him from Mandalorian, he looks like a guy who's working out. He was always looked diesel. And whether you're comparing some of his early pictures from when he was briefly with at the time, the Oakland Raiders, the first, in the early 70s, and even when he trained, he trained at Vince's gym. And that's Vince Garanda, for those who don't know. He didn't train at Gold's. He didn't train with Arnold to any large extent that I know. There's a lot of pictures of him with Vince Garanda, and I think Rick Wayne, another big name from that era. And he just was somebody where exercise was a huge part of his life. And I don't know that there's any talk of him doing anything other than, I don't think he was a heavy smoker or necessarily a big drinker. But so many people, even just today, have come out and talk about what a wonderful guy he was and how terrific he was to work with, and and all of that. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult when someone passes unexpectedly. Not that if they're on their last legs, that it's great, but I think about Stallone, and many of you remember that he and Bruce Willis had issues on the Expendables movie that Bruce didn't do because he wanted too much for what would have been nothing more than an extended cameo. And Sly at that time was very upset with Bruce, but fortunately they reconciled. Now you might not remember this because everything wasn't on the internet in 2005 era, but there was an issue between Stallone and Carl Weathers in the mid-2000s when Stallone was preparing the movie Rocky Balboa, where, similar to, as I was saying, the first thought process that they were going to try to do as far as, let's cast an actual boxer in a role. And I know that they used Andre Ward in Creed, but it's a little bit different. Ward was already retired. He cast Antonio Tarver as, I think the character's name was Mason Dixon. It's not really that great of a name. But in that movie, Stallone asked Weathers for permission to use some of the footage. I don't really understand why he had to ask permission. Maybe because the Winkler owned the movie. Like that part I'm not sure on. But Weathers lobbied to come back. And I remember thinking, what do you mean lobby to come back? Or they're just going to have flashback scenes? What the fuck? That never made any sense to me. So they had a falling out over that because Weathers wanted a significant amount of money, and both guys, it seemed like they were never going to be friendly again, which, as a fan of both, I was upset about that. But then they reconciled. And Stallone's real issue was unfortunately, with Irwin Winkler, and you may have seen all that nasty, well, it's not even nasty back and forth, it's more one way, because Irwin Winkler is in his 90s. But Stallone is still angry. But as a fan of Stallone, I am heartened, and I'm glad that he and Bruce Willis made peace before Bruce got sick, unfortunately. And that for a number of years now, Stallone and Carl Weathers, whatever nonsense they got involved with, and that Sly was really upset with Carl over that, they got over it. They made up. And because, you don't, even somebody as successful as Stallone, I would imagine you don't want somebody to pass and that you don't get to say a proper goodbye. And I was just thinking of, Bill Murray, today being Groundhog Day, that Bill Murray and Harold Ramis had a major falling out during the making of that film, and they had been so close. The guys had been like brothers, and they really weren't friends for a really long time. And Ramis was very sick, and Murray went to see him, and they buried the hatchet, and they made peace. And as a very young person, it may not seem like a big deal when something like that happens, but I can tell you, when you get older, and when people who maybe are a generation ahead of you or even 2 generations, you don't want somebody to go without if you're lucky, saying goodbye, but without making peace with them, especially if it was over just nonsensical bullshit. In the case of both, with Stallone and Willis and Stallone and Weathers, it was all about money. And they all had money. I mean, Bruce, my God, how much money he had. That's why, I feel like that's why Stallone was so aggravated, because it's like, bro, what are you doing? Why are you being such a hard ass about this? Come on, you're seeing Arnold is working for scale. What are you worried about? We're all going to make. They settled it, and thank goodness they settled it. And there's really not much else. There's not much else to say other than the obvious, which is the people who knew him, who are grieving, and who will be mourning, because it does seem like, and we don't know, it could come out that this could be something awful, like Chadwick Boseman, who was very sick, and only a few people knew that he was very sick. And what was he, 43, 44 when he passed? It might come out that Carl had been sick and just didn't tell anybody. We don't know. We'll find out. But for now, it's just shock and sadness and memory of a very important figure for so many movie fans. And with that brings the Carl Weathers episode to a conclusion. I'm not going to name the episode by a number because Carl was 76 when he passed. And I'm not going to impugn his memory by putting a number on this particular episode. So I would say thanks to Hollywood for finding him, for allowing him to shine in so many different roles, to be great. When he started as a football player and was so solid, and the craft, that he was such a strong actor that he actually got an Emmy nomination. And I'm sure in 85, 86, there were people saying, you could have nominated him for supporting actor Rocky IV. He's really good. He's still the best thing about that movie, other than the fight scene at the end, Paulie with the robot and all that shit. But this has been the Carl Weathers episode of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this, for this very sort of somber occasion, and reminiscing about the career of, one of the favorites for so many of us. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel and haven't done so already and enjoyed the content, click like, subscribe, turn on the notifications. Or if you're catching the episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. I'll be back with the actual numbered episode real soon. Peace.